This is actually pretty useful for synchronizing audio. Check it out. 1, 2, 3, bang. That was loud. Samurai knowledge. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Mike Varela, and this is Tonetuga TV. So this month, I spent a few days on the East Coast with the Myrtle Beach State Park, doing one last sweep for sea turtle nests before the Memorial Day rush. It was a beautiful weekend all around, but it was around a 4-hour drive for me. From where I live in Charlotte. When I drive long distances, I like to listen to audiobooks, and this go round, I didn't have anything downloaded already, so before I hopped in the car, I hopped on Audible, and this was the first thing on the front page. The Book of 5 Rings by Miyoto Musashi. And my first thought when I saw this was, hell yeah, samurai knowledge. And it's probably the case that people that get the most use out of samurai knowledge probably don't say the words, hell yeah, samurai knowledge, but that's besides the point. I downloaded the book and I listened to the whole thing that weekend. So first off, a little about the book. The Book of 5 Rings was written by master Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi in the mid-1600s. Now, this guy was an absolute badass. He claims to have won over 60 one-on-one sword duels. He fights with 2 swords like freaking Darth Maul in The Phantom Menace. When you see him and you're like, oh, it's the guy with the red face from the beginning of the movie. Oh, shit, and he's got 2 lightsabers. That's Miyamoto Musashi. He's an official sword saint of Japan, and most notably, he passed down his principles to future generations in the form of the Book of 5 Rings. And I'm driving, and I'm listening to it, and to be fair, most of the book is, okay, when the guy picks his sword up high, you gotta swing your sword down low. But there is a lot of really good and relevant knowledge in this book, and there's one thing in particular that I want to talk about. So in the book, he has these 21 life principles to live by, and one of them was this: do not possess ancient weapons intended to be preserved for future generations. So, right, pretty innocuous, but I'm getting to that point. The translator goes on to interpret the context of that original writing and says this: one becomes attached to an old object and tries to preserve it. One can possess an object, but one can also be possessed by an object. A man might possess an object that came into his hands in a certain particular way, and may attach a special value to it for that reason, especially if that object came down to him from his ancestors. One must be wary of this sort of attachment, particularly as it comes into play when choosing a weapon. An antique object may be precious, but what is important here is usefulness. Therefore, it is necessary to free oneself from conditioning that is based upon a value that is perverted from the point of view of one's primary goal. Now, right off the bat, how apt is this to the guitar community? I mean, all of us covet things like 60s Strats and Dumbles and Klon Centaurs. And why? Because we've got a false sense of utility attached to it, and the idea that this type of vintage gear is somehow superior to modern day gear. And don't get me wrong, even as I'm saying this, I still think vintage gear is super cool, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't want some of it eventually. But I've owned one vintage amp in my life before, and it was a nightmare. And I have the ability to troubleshoot a lot of this old stuff, but to the average person, it's going to be nothing but a headache. And maybe there is something special about vintage gear, but at the very, very least, I know that it is not technology. Because if there's one thing that I do know, it's that technology usually doesn't get worse. It always tends to get better. There's no reason why a guitar made by a CNC machine using a flawless model and the tighter tolerances of modern day electronics shouldn't be superior to a vintage guitar in every way. What is truly important is how comfortable you are with your equipment. If you have small hands, like me, I typically gravitate towards Strats and Tellys simply because the neck carve is more modest than that of a Les Paul, and I just feel more comfortable playing it. Vintage hand-wired amps are the exact same. They've sold us on this idea that bigger components means bigger power, and that's not always relevant when it comes to 120 volts. If that was the case, PCBs would have never been invented, and technology wouldn't keep getting smaller and thinner every year. What is more important is reliability. When I turn on a new amp, I know that it's gonna work. I don't have to make a blood sacrifice or do a rain dance to the amp gods. and cross my fingers every time I turn it on. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. It's funny to think that samurai 500 years ago were sitting around sniffing corks and arguing about whose sword was better. And here we are 500 years later having pretty much the exact same argument with each other. You need to play with the gear that's most practical for you to play with. But that's all for today. Thanks again for hanging out. I really did enjoy this book, and I think it's worth a read. It might not necessarily be all relevant for the guitar community, but there is a lot of good general life lessons and stuff in there, and I didn't hate it, and it was free, which is my favorite type of book. If you like the content, please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see all of you very soon. Take 2. You need to play the gear that is most practical. That's all for today.